Hello and welcome back to the Bearded Nerd Podcast. Today we're talking about one of the most critical but often overlooked aspects of game mastering: pacing. How do you keep your sessions engaging without dragging things out or rushing the action? How do you balance exploration, combat, and roleplay so that players stay invested? Pacing is the secret ingredient that keeps your players hooked, whether you're running an epic multi-year campaign or a one-shot. In this episode, we'll break down how to control the flow of your game, manage slow moments, and make sure your players stay engaged from start to finish. So without further ado, let's dive into it. What we need to do first is understand what pacing is and why is pacing so important. Good pacing keeps players engaged and immersed in the story. It prevents long-winded sections from dragging on and combat from becoming a slog. It also helps balance different playstyles. As we all know, some players really love combat. Others prefer roleplay, and the rest prefer exploration or something else. So by ensuring that you understand what pacing is and why you need to have it, it builds the framework for you as a GM to utilize pacing in your everyday practice or in the skill of GMing. And one of the things that I see often, both in myself and what I had to learn, and in others who've come to me, pacing can come up in a variety of issues. It can either be too slow, where the players get bored or disengaged or even distracted. They get on their phone, they go on Instagram, and they just kind of scroll. Or it's too fast. Players feel rushed and they don't get enough time to make a meaningful choice. This may be because you're trying to push through whatever story or bit that you're trying to get through and you just go too fast. So sometimes that creates an uneven pacing where some sections drag and others pass too quickly. So in order to combat that, let's find out how we manage pacing. The biggest thing that I can recommend is to find a natural rhythm to your session based upon previous sessions and go with that. I personally believe that every game session has a natural flow. It has a setup, a rising action, a climactic action, and a resolution. You can use this you can even rename it into the ORC system: the opening action, the rising action, and the climactic action. That is specifically used in Critical Dice's deck of cards. It was or deck of stories, where you can pull out different cards to build a session essentially. But in this case, we're going to add a resolution step to it. But either way, you need to have and find that natural flow. Mind you, you don't have to have or follow this perfectly, but keeping this in mind can help create a great session. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. So in the setup part of your session, you recap last session, you set the scene for the current session, and remind the players of their objectives, and even provide them with what are your opening actions. For example, player 1, based upon this recap, the scene that you're in, what are your actions? This could take up to 10 or 20 minutes or so of time, but it just depends on how you pace things. Again, 10 to 20 minutes is a really good trajectory or goalpost for you to aim for. Now, the rising action, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of your session. This is where the players investigate, explore, roleplay, and encounter obstacles. This can take 1 hour to 2 hours tops. I recommend and really like the 2-hour mark because it gives every player, if you have more than 3 players, it gives them about 20 minutes or so, 20 to 30 minutes, give or take, to investigate, to explore, and to encounter whatever obstacles. And the great thing how you divide this is by literally having a stopwatch or a timer where you place 15, 20 minutes per player before moving on to the next player. That way you give them undivided attention for them to do whatever they want to do as kind of the main stage person or player during that time frame. From there, you move on to the climactic action, right? This is 30 minutes to 60 minutes, about an hour or so, where there's a big reveal or perhaps even a dramatic choice that's made. And obviously, if this leads into combat, this is where you can start your combat. And depending on how long you run your session, you can either start a majority part or the major part of combat, or even have your combat in that session. What do I mean by that? Well, for me, I run a 3 to 4 hour game. So combat can usually take, for the 3 players that I have plus myself running NPCs, that could be about 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours of combat. So what I would do is I would plan for that climactic action to take place earlier on, or even in the beginning of the next session, if there's a combat involved, right? But if there's no combat involved, that's a good 60 minutes of basic interactions, but more importantly, big reveal, dramatic scenes, narration, things of that nature. And then finally, the resolution, the wrapping up of the session, the consequences of their choices, right? And setting up the next session. Altogether, if you were to calculate it, that's about 3 hours and 40 minutes, 4 hours maybe tops. So you have a good little section of things that you can do. Now, mind you, if you want even, let's say you have 2 hours where you kind of combine the rising action and the climactic action, right? The players investigate, and within 10 minutes of investigation, they run into a combat situation. Well, perfect. You can go through that and kind of work that combat out naturally. Not a big deal. There's not really a cutoff unless you really have to. Obviously, it's your game night. So you kind of have to go about it based upon what your needs are. But this is an example, especially since I play between 3 and 4 hours a session. This is my perfect flow. And this is what keeps my players engaged. Now, having mentioned keeping the players engaged, something I really want to focus on is rotating that spotlight so that every player gets time to contribute. I mentioned earlier that I give my players about 20 minutes or so of spotlight time. Well, this is also something that's really important to keep in mind. As you're rotating the spotlight, you're going to want to watch for energy dips. And what I mean by that is when the player just seems disengaged, right? Maybe you need to pick up the pace, maybe you need to add some tension, or maybe you need to point the spotlight at that player for a bit, right? When I see my players disengaged, I go ahead and say, okay, whatever the player's character name is, you're hearing all this, you see what's going on. What does your player think and how would your player interact, right? Just to kind of quickly move the spotlight so that they can focus or refocus, and then it brings them back to the story. It's a great one, especially when your players have ADHD or have ADD of some sort. This is a great tool to use to bring folks back in, right? And this is kind of part of the player-driven pacing that I love implementing. I love to let my players set the tempo because it gives them the choice to really engage with the story at that time. A great example that if you have a player who's just kind of like spending too much time on something, that player-driven pacing can really kick in. But let's dive into this topic really quick. Let's say you have a player who spends too much time on something, right? We've all had the players spending a little bit too much time debating their next move, right? Whether it's an investigation or whether it's combat, whatever it may be. You've probably often heard of people utilizing a physical clock to showcase that something is happening, that something is coming about. We need to show this, so I'm going to put this little clock here. You can do that. You can even, this is probably the cheaper of the options, but as the GM, you can even just introduce a quasi, quote unquote, ticking clock, so to speak. The ticking clock mechanic, if you will, where you can even say you hear footsteps approaching in the hallway. You have 30 seconds to decide what to do and put the timer on your phone. Very simple, straightforward, not something that is too difficult to implement. It's going to keep those players engaged. Having mentioned combat role-playing exploration, I would be a horrible GM if I didn't mention how to balance each and how to use pacing for each. From a combat perspective, just try to avoid long drawn-out fights. Let's limit excessive enemy turns, right? If there's too many minions slowing things down, maybe you allow the goblins to, or whatever the minions that you're using, to basically meet their end sooner rather than later. You can use a lot of cinematic narration to make each round feel impactful without causing it to be a scene, so to speak. And what do I mean by scene? I mean, oh, you're noticing that the minions are taking too much time and they aren't going down. Well, you can use a cinematic narration where perhaps the next time the wizard casts a certain spell, all the minions start sweating, or all the minions start getting nervous and start fleeing, doing like a courage test, right? And they start leaving because they don't want to fight this anymore, whatever it may be. You're adding that cinematic aspect to it. You can add environmental changes that perhaps mid-fight, that perhaps keep things fresh, right? If time is on your side, you can add those environmental changes like collapsing bridges or shifting rocks or earth beneath their feet, things like that, right? You want to keep them engaged. And depending on how much time you have, those are great ways to kind of keep the pacing of combat appropriately there, so for lack of better words. Now, from a roleplay perspective, keep the conversations meaningful, right? Focus on the purpose of the scene. Is this scene advancing the story or the characters' relationships, or is it just there for filler, right? We've all probably seen anime, and we've all probably thought to ourselves, oh, this is a filler episode, right? The classic filler episode of them going to the beach or something like that. All right, how does this really advance the story? It doesn't, it's just filler. Oh, okay, got it, right? We've all had that feeling. So let's try avoid using those filler scenes or those filler sessions unless we really need to. And if the party really needs to do that, then that's a different story where you have a conversation about it. But from there, you can really just keep it going by using these opportunities for skill checks and social challenges, right? To really make sure that the players are engaged. A great way to also implement this from a role-playing perspective is, hey, if we're going to go shopping, right? The classic shopping montage. Raise your hand if you like the shopping montage. Okay, let's say 3 out of the 7 players like it. Well, you guys or you all can meet on a separate day or even online to talk about that. And then the 4 out of the 7 that do not want the shopping montage, you could be doing something else. That could be a great time for downtime activities, right? So you can kind of chop it up a little bit, or you can even use exploration in this case for those that don't want to go shopping. You can use this as a great opportunity for downtime or exploration. But speaking about exploration pacing is a bit different on how we handle it. From an exploration perspective, we want to make sure that we avoid endless meandering, right? We want to give clear but open-ended choices. For example, there's a village ahead, but you also notice smoke rising from the forest. Where do you go? That's a pretty open-ended choice there. You don't know which one they're going to choose, but you're giving them clear options, right? You can use random or scripted events to shake things up, right? Like a random encounter, that's totally fine. But from an exploration perspective, if we go back to the shopping montage, for those 4 who didn't want to go shopping and they can explore the city or the village that they're in, you can give them clear choices. Hey, there's a blacksmith or there's a spice market. Which one do you want to go to? You wait for their answer and then you proceed forward. The point of what you're trying to do with exploration and its pacing is to give the players a choice, right? You want to leave it open-ended because you're not going to sandbox, or you're not going to railroad them rather, but you are going to give them choices that you have some sort of preparation for, and then you're going to continue as you need to. More importantly, you're going to have the necessary information to allow your players to basically keep it moving. That would be the premise of this part, is keep it moving by giving your players a clear choice to make. There are 3 tools, though, that I think improve pacing, and I would recommend you utilize as a GM. The first rule, or the first tool rather, is the 3-clue rule. If you want your players to discover an important piece of information, give them at least 3 ways for them to find it. This really avoids frustration if they miss a single clue, and it keeps the story moving. Here's an example. You're trying to find the hidden assassin's identity, right? Here's the 3 clues. A witness saw them leave. There's a piece of fabric from their cloak that was found on the scene. And there's a letter in one of the NPC's office that hints at their next move. You can go back and use the open-ended but clear choice option, where you can ask the players, okay, what are you going to do? How are you going to pursue this? What out of these 3 things you're going to pursue? Are you going to talk to the witness? Are you going to investigate that piece of fabric? Are you going to try to read the letter in the office, right? Those are 3 choices, but you're giving the player a clear choice to choose from. You're giving them an option to choose from, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is not railroading at all. That allows you to understand, because you as the GM need to have that information to continue the session and to continue the storytelling. You can utilize timers, which is the second tool that you utilize that I've already mentioned, and it's a real good thing to implement, especially for newer players. Using a real timer on your phone, or a sand clock, or whatever, one of those things, it's a great way to really force the players to make decisions and prevent analysis paralysis, right? You can even just narrate it and say, hey, you have 60 seconds to decide how to defuse this magical sigil. Boom, here you go. 60 seconds on the clock, right? You can use that in-game urgency to push players forward, because obviously villains don't wait. They will not wait for the heroes to go. The world is going to continue to move on, and the world will not care if they hesitate. They will continue to move on. It's very similar to what I said in our episode featuring dynamic world building, where the world does not wait for the players or those characters. It will continue forward. So this is a great example of that. And finally, scene transitions, cutting straight to the action. If nothing interesting is happening, just fast forward to the next important event, right? If you're traveling from one place to another, you can role play the travel. Ginny D on YouTube has some great information and great tips on how to make travel interesting. It's great stuff. But if you're like me, you can describe what they see. You can utilize the 5 senses to kind of showcase what's going on. But this is something that I do. After I kind of set up the travel scene, so to speak, and let them know what they see and what they hear, what they're feeling, I go to the players and say, okay, actions for you. What would you like to do during this time while you're traveling? And then they proceed to tell me, because They're actively telling me what they want to do. So I'm going to listen to them. If they say, oh, I'm just going to get ready to go to the next village. Okay. Oh, I'm going to read this book while I'm on horseback. Oh, okay, cool. Do this, this, and that. Okay, whatever the rules or mechanics that I need to utilize. And then I just fast forward and say, okay, after a grueling week long on the journey on the road, you finally reach the gate to the capital city, and the guards eye you warily as you approach. What do? Right? I just skip all that unless I really want to have a random encounter. I just skip it all. There's no need to focus on something that's not going to push the story forward unless it's going to push the story forward. Now, there are two things that I really recommend you have to do to adapt your pacing to different play styles. And that's one, learn to read the room, right? Some players love slow, immersive storytelling. And if that's your players, then just follow their lead, right? But then there's also some that really, 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 really want action-packed sessions. They want hack and slash. They want explosions. They basically want a Michael Bay movie, but in a TTRPG. Then if that's the case, do it, right? Adjust your pacing based on player engagement. If they're leaning in and interacting, let things breathe. If they're disengaged, speed things up, right? You might have to just adjust a little bit, but that's okay, because if the players aren't joining, that's the whole goal, right? And then by letting the player drive, right, let them sit in the driver's seat. Let the players control the flow of the game to some extent. If they want to explore every corner of the dungeon, let them. But introduce the risks and rewards to keep it interesting. If they seem eager for combat, transition onto some sort of unexpected encounter, right? We're talking about dungeon diving. Let them go into every corner, but let them know that there's some risks. And then maybe if you see a couple of the players kind of itching for combat, as you're describing what's going on and as they enter the room, you describe it where they enter the dark room looking for another treasure chest when they see two beady eyes staring back at them. Roll for initiative, right? Something as simple as that you can kind of play with. But again, let the players drive it and just just read the room. Let them kind of proceed at their own comfort level. And before I give my final thoughts, I really want to thank folks on Patreon who have been supporting me in this podcast. It has been a huge blessing to have you all in my life as supporters of this podcast. If you have been enjoying this podcast so far, please check out my content on Patreon, where I drop additional podcast episodes. I drop early releases of the podcast, and I share 5th edition compatible content for you to use in your campaign, as well as really good generic, in the sense of TTRPG agnostic settings and mechanics and things that you can just plug and play into your world. So if you have enjoyed this podcast so far and want to support me, be sure to check me out on Patreon. The link will be in the show notes itself. Last, but certainly not least, here are a couple of common pitfalls from a pacing perspective and how you can fix them. So number 1, the info dump. The GM explains too much at once, causing players to just become disengaged. I've done it because I just love sharing information and sharing lore. The way I've learned to fix it is to deliver information in small, digestible pieces so that the players can uncover the details themselves. A great example of this is, instead of narrating a kingdom's entire political history, have an NPC mention a single intriguing rumor that players can start investigating and rolling for history checks. And then you start revealing from the NPC's perspective about that kind of info dump, or the classic lore dump. Secondly, the endless debate problem. Players just get stuck on discussing options endlessly. They just talk and talk about every little plan that they need to make. So instead, introduce an NPC that has a particular opinion on the matter, right? And let them lead that. Introduce environmental changes and that ticking clock mechanic to push them forward. You can kind of make it up as you go, but let's just say that the players are fighting and they don't know if they need to cross the bridge or jump off the side of the bridge or go back or whatever, but they're on a bridge. And you say, hey, you hear an impatient sigh from the merchant behind you trying to cross the bridge while the bridge seems rickety and unstable. What do you do? Or you can even say, okay, you hear an impatient sigh from the merchant that you're negotiating with. And then the noble says, decide quickly, I have other matters to attend to. What do you do? Right? You're kind of giving them that, hey, there's a sense of urgency here. So for the endless debate problem, just make sure that you provide a fixed outcome, whether it's an NPC saying something, an environmental change, or that ticking clock mechanic. Make sure that you basically say, hey, this is what's on the line here. You need to make a decision within this time frame. Last but certainly not least, the overtly long combat session. This issue is pretty straightforward. The fight is dragging on and players are losing interest. So my take on this, give players that cinematic action. Introduce an environmental hazard that's causing maybe the minions or the enemies to escape or to run away because something is happening. A great example of this is in the film adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. You see that the goblins, after the cave troll has been defeated, the party, the fellowship, hear more goblins coming, so they run and escape. And as more goblins are catching up and they're surrounded, they hear the roar of the Balrog. This was an introduction of a new environmental hazard where a Balrog is here and the goblins just flee, right? They just leave. This is a great way, an example of introducing a cinematic action where maybe a bigger foe or an ally even comes in to help save the day. Either way you choose it, introduce that cinematic action to reduce that overtly long combat. And if you need to, reduce the enemy HP, right? Maybe you reduce it by half, or you introduce some sort of fear mechanic where now they are running away from the players, and every time that a player lands a successful hit, boom, you remove them. Like it's a very simple, quick way to do it. Again, you may feel a little bad about reducing that enemy HP, but trust me, especially with D&D 5e, combat can go on forever. So try implementing those three tools and tips and see how it comes out next session. Pacing is one of the most important tools in a GM's arsenal. When done well, it keeps your players immersed, engaged, and eager for more. By balancing combat, roleplay, and exploration, and knowing when to speed up or slow things down, you can craft sessions that feel cinematic, exciting, and full of momentum. So if you found this episode helpful, share it with your fellow GMs, and let me know what pacing techniques have worked for you. Don't forget to subscribe for more GM tips, and as always, much love and keep gaming.